those who are joining us on a gloriously warm afternoon, a Sunday afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us. So I think I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Asianism Retold. I've been particularly interested in this whole idea of Asian values in the context of multiple modernities. Now, our past couple of decades studies have shown that modernity is not linear. It's not a linear progression from tradition to modernity, from conservatism to liberalism, from internationalism to localization, from the north to the south, from the west to the east. It's about really having the north in the south and the west in the east, or the east in the west. It isn't a linear process. And let me give you an example. I mean, the one that I always find very, I quote very often is the Kiritsu from Japan, which is a way of doing business based on human relationships, where that is placed at the center of these business relationships, of these networks. And the Kiritsu is, as some of you might know, followed from what was called the Daibatsus, which were during World War II, and they were abolished during America's reformation of Japan. And the reason for this was believed to be that these are traditional ways, these are old ways of doing business. They don't stand ground in today's modern world, and therefore we must do away with them. But very interestingly, we find that companies across the world in Japan are bringing back the system. And so now you have a hybrid, between a very strict contractual way of doing business, where I'm in a relationship with you only till the contract lasts, but also a hybrid with bringing in these human relations, this informality, which is also valued now. And also, the Daibutsus, which were based on family-based businesses, which really went out. Today, we have most of the wealth generated in the world by family businesses. Professor Mark Thompson, from where you come, Hong Kong, along with being a very modern financial hub, it's also the hub for family-based businesses. So the point I'm really trying to make is that modernity hasn't moved as many theorists thought, as a progression, as a linear progression. It has in fact been neither this nor that, and it has really been a process about this and that. The other bit is that it has neither been a homogenizing process. It hasn't, the previous thinking again of modernity being converging, process of convergence hasn't held ground as well. If you look at perhaps the three pillars very roughly of modernity, or what were believed to be pillars of modernity: individual rights, free market economies, democratic principles, the world hasn't moved towards these principles as a convergence. In fact, you find distinctions between different sections far greater now than ever before, between the rich and the poor, between those who have the vaccine and those who don't. And so you have different divisions. And these divisions between countries of the same economic level as well. So between the US and parts of Europe, between Japan and the US, and so on. And we can talk about those differences later. But the important point being that one of the differentiating factors which has been ignored so far has been identity, has been values in shaping multiple modernities. And this is coming back in vogue. This is becoming also very important to understand and give us reasons about why modernity hasn't been linear, hasn't been homogeneous, how it's taking on peculiarities of a particular country, a particular region, and to understand the role of values, primordial ties, ethnicity, language, gender, land, all these aspects. Now, these again, I must remind ourselves that these aspects of primordial ties, of values, as we were setting out to modernize the world maybe 80 years ago, were considered inconsequential. They were also considered important to make inconsequential. It was believed that, in this whole modernizing process, we must make these aspects of identity primordial ties very insignificant to actually the 3-4 broad pillars that we thought that the world would converge to. And today we know that no country can ignore that. We see that across the world. We see that in the US, with ethnicity playing a very, very important role in terms of how they will modernize, how they will progress further. So I come to the first point, which is what therefore is Asianism retold. I think in the context of this, I would say that Asianism retold is really about looking at this whole idea of values in the context of multiple modernities for Asia itself, and how that will play a role. Now, when you talk about values, there's great excitement. People will say, oh yes, we are different from the West, and yes, we must understand who we are, and there's something about us. Now, in saying that, there is a clearer idea in my sense about the them, and perhaps not such a clear idea about the us. There is also a great reference again to the them versus us, which, like I said, because we must look at this whole topic about multiple modernities, which is taking place across the world. Latin America will have to look at it, Europe will have to look at it, America will have to look at it, Asia will have to look at it. So we must look at it for the purposes of what it will mean for Asia, and really move away from this dichotomy of us versus them, the West and the rest, and not replace it with the East versus the rest now. Let me also take a minute to explain that the reason for saying this is also lessons that we've learned from past thinkers on Asianism as well. I'd spoken during the last roundtable that this is not a new idea. This is coming back in vogue. But we have the advantage of learning from our past, the past movements on this. And let me broadly take you to 3 significant ones. The first being in the 1920s. So we had 2 major thinkers, Rabindranath Tagore, a poet, a thinker, a Nobel laureate from an undivided South Asia, who said that Eastern values and spirituality must replace Western materialism. So again, he was looking at it in the dichotomy of West versus East. And he received great challenge in several parts of Asia, including China, that was at that time going through, the new cultural movement, where young people said, no, but we want to go with Western ideas of democracy, of science. And, these traditional ideas, these Asian ideas haven't really helped us to solve China's problem. And then came Tenching Okakura, who said, again, that, we are an answer to the West. And if we are to look at any country in order to find our source for what is Asianism, we must look at Japan. And the reason for looking at Japan is because that has been an insular country. It hasn't been, ruled by an outsider. It's almost a museum for Japan. And so Japan is our source, and with India and China as pillars for this Asianism. But again, he was received great opposition from a very interesting essay that was written saying goodbye to Asia. A person called Fukuzawa Yukichi, who is a thinker from Japan, who said that, we must leave Asia. We can't wait for the rest of Asia to progress and to modernize. We must find a way to join Europe. And which also is perhaps what is happening with Turkey at the moment, with President Erdogan saying that, European values will get consolidated. As an Asian, I can say that I am very sad that, Asia doesn't really have an identity that attracts the Turks anymore. And therefore, once we join the European Union, that's when Europe's values will also get consolidated. Of course, there's several, resistances that he is facing there. But Okakura again changed his thinking, and he said, I think what is important for us is to take both the aspect of being part of the West and also retaining our Asianness, our Japaneseness. And many scholars believe that the reason for Japan's success has been the fact that as they modernized, they were able to become even more Japanese and even more Asian. So it was a simultaneous process. So I think with that, I want to say that the first thing we're thinking under Asianism Retold is that it isn't anymore about the West versus the East. It's about thinking about Asian values for the sake of Asia itself and for this whole context of multiple modernities. Of course, thereafter came Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir Mohamad from Malaysia, who also joined, that was the second movement in the 1990s, who also sort of took this position of West. And the second reason why we should move away from this West versus East is because as thinkers today are saying that the future is Asian, and we can contest that if you like. But again, going back to Dr. Kishore Mahbubani, who says that, Asia has moved out of its basic subsistence occupation, the need to get food on the table. We've luckily in the last 40, 50 years managed to move out of that stage. What else do we have to offer to the world? We've got to think about that. Asia as a region, we've got to think about what else can we offer to the rest of the world. And that is not going to come from constantly comparing ourselves with the West. Or another recent thinker, Dr. Sanjay Katuria, he's a lead economist and coordinator for South Asia integration at the World Bank, who says that, yes, as we put these new ideas into the world, and we're thinking about what Asia can offer to the rest of the world, the one thing that sits very much as a gaping hole is the mistrust in the region. And that hasn't come as a result of efforts to integrate the region. If at all, it has come from actually putting in our own systems, and in many places he quotes informal systems, that have really helped to bridge gaps. And he's used that in the borders. He's also used that in the context of modern slavery, an aspect that I worked on. So that's the first point. The second, and I'm going to take just 2 more minutes as the moderator. I shouldn't run over time myself, but I think it's important to set the context very correct at the beginning. So the first point being is that I hope that during today's discussion, we will try and move away from comparing ourselves and defining ourselves in context or in reference to the West. There will be part of that, but let's try and see who we are for ourselves. The second bit is that, and this came up during the last roundtable, is that, while there's great excitement when you talk about Asian values, it's an extremely complex area as well. And often it can be an extremely problematic area. It can be a complete romantic indulgence. 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion people who sit in India could have 1.4 billion values. So how are we going to integrate all of that? So the second thing is that we aren't looking at a set of values that the whole of Asia must conform to. We're really looking at trying to define a sensibility, an Asian sensibility, and a system that can really capture the sensibility, and therefore that allowing for different values or a common idea of our values, and to look at the different ways in which they permeate Asia. And let me take you through 2 stories very quickly on that. The first one is from Professor Manakia. She's a professor of Indo-Persian studies at Columbia University and author of an extremely interesting book called Persian Itself, In fact, it's a book that Professor Shahab Inam Khan and I bought in Delhi a few months ago. And so she talks about what did it mean to be Persian before nationalism happened. What was Persianism? And she said it didn't belong to a religion. It didn't belong to a particular country. So she asks herself this question and she comes up with two answers, which is one is that she says she goes back to, a practice that her mother did on New Year's. And she said, we as a family and my mother would open Hafiz's poems and she would read from that, or we would all read from that. Now the poem that a person picked and the manner in which they interpreted that was really telling of the kind of year they would have. And in that, there was scope for multiple interpretations. And those multiplicities of interpretations was very important because they created similarities in many ways, but they also created differences in many ways, which was important because those differences were linked to a common idea. They were linked, they were in relation to each other. Those differences were in relation to each other. And then she talks about a second aspect in terms of what Persianism means. And she said, the second bit was language. And again, she said here, language was not what you speak and what you write. It was a sensibility. And she talks about a word called adab. And many from South Asia might know what I mean when I say adab. And again, it points to the fact that sometimes our modern language doesn't have the vocabulary to really explain what it is. But when you hear words like this, you sort of know what I'm saying. And that happens to us all the time. And she says the same thing. She says that the modern language has been hopelessly insufficient to contain the paradoxes, the multiplicities, the different interpretations that we have, because even the language of Persian, in terms of how it permeated Asia, how it permeated, how an artist uses it, how somebody from the government uses it, how different regions within that big expanse uses it would be very different. And that difference was very important as much as the similarities. Last, a personal story, and perhaps the reason why I even started this project at Harvard was I come from a Hindu family, and my grandmother was a big influence on me. She was from a political family, but she did a lot in community. She and my grandfather had a very unusual way of praying, which I now know is unusual. For me at that time, it was very natural. They would sit down to pray and they would tell each other stories, or they would sing to each other. Now, they were both not gifted in the singing skills or the playing instrument skills, but they would still, tell each other stories and sing to each other. And I, as a child, wanted to be in that environment of those stories. I didn't understand anything. So I was given, or I would volunteer to take on the duty of cleaning the temple and putting flowers. And so while I would sit with her, she would say, okay, whom do you want to pray to today? And in Hinduism, we have several gods. And I would say Lord Krishna, the Lord of love. And so we would pray to Lord Krishna on one day. The next day, she would ask me the same question. And not having much to say, I would say, Lord Krishna again. And she would say, why? Why should you pray to him? He is the Lord of love. But do you even know his wife's name? What sort of Lord of love is he that his wife is given no prominence? We know him by, Radha, and we know him by Meera. So why must you pray to him? And I would go back with these questions and, really think about, why am I praying to him? But I think for me, that sowed really the seeds of being able to contain paradoxes. That while faith is important, it is equally important to have doubt, because that's what cleanses your mind. And the two sit together. When you have faith, you can doubt. You should be allowed to doubt. And you can only have doubt if you have faith. Otherwise, why would it even matter? So all I want to say is that as we talk about systems on Asianism retold, let's try and look at these subtleties and try and build a system that can contain not a language, a common language for Asia, but a common vocabulary for our different languages for Asia. And while we've named ourselves Asianism Retold, we are really Asianism retelling, and it's still very much a work in progress. And each one of you is part of it. And I'm also joined by a stellar team. Litsi Kursinkal, who you'll hear from very soon, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal from NICE, and John Lim from the Center for Asia Leadership. And with that, I have the honor of inviting our first speaker, Professor Soyoung Kim, director at the Korea Policy Center of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, to really take us through how is it that we can think Asian.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Can you hear me now? Well? Okay. So let me just share my slide. Okay. Yes. Wait a minute. Okay. Right. Yes. Thank you again for inviting me to this really great opportunity to present some of my thoughts that I had since the COVID-19 began in relation to Asian values. I haven't been really thinking much about Asian values for quite a long time since I wrote a paper on 4 dimensions of Asian values. It was almost 10 years ago when I had interest in Asian values just because as a political scientist and also political economist, I was quite interested in how cultural variables or cultural factors can meaningfully explain the variations we observe across countries of different cultures. And of course, at the time, there were a lot of talks about Asian uniqueness or Asian values. So my interest was to really find out whether those Asian values indeed exist. So I tried to capture Asian values using some survey data. And these are somewhat quite common dimensions I found from the literature review. So for example, feminism, emphasis on family as a basic unit of social and individual life, and also filial piety, unconditional respect for the elderly parents, and also obedience to their wishes, and communitarianism, or sometimes I think it's also called communism, but because of confusion, right, with communism, it's better to be read as communitarianism. And this is particularly quite strong in many Asian countries. That is primacy of group or community goals over individual wishes or individual freedom. And finally, work ethic, which we can typically find in long work hours in Japan, South Korea, and many East Asian countries. So briefly, this is the finding from that study. So some of the findings were in line of expectations. For example, communitarianism and work ethic tend to be higher in Asia compared to other regions. So in this table, this is a sub-Saharan Africa developing country. I just forgot the rest of developing countries, and this is West European countries and Northern American countries. So the baseline category here in this regression table is Asian countries. So these positive ones, like the red ones, these are feminism and also authoritarianism. In other words, these regions actually show higher scores on these dimensions. So they were quite in contrast to our expectations. So feminism and authoritarian attitudes tend to be lower in East Asian countries, unlike our expectations. So in short, the finding says it's not quite clear. And also it's very difficult to really find strong empirical evidence supporting the idea that Asians have a very common cultures coming from, say, Confucianism or other cultural heritages. But because of COVID-19, I just came to have interest in how these Asian values can explain some of the interesting differences in national responses to the COVID-19 crisis. In particular, out of these four dimensions, I was quite interested in how dimensions like communitarianism and authoritarianism can play in effective responses against COVID-19. And indeed, so today I'm not really presenting a solid academic study, but rather some of the tendencies I have found. For example, mask wearing, especially in the early months of COVID-19, I actually think of this more like an Asian style of mask wearing because it was reported quite often in the first 6 months of 2020. For example, here, Asians are more likely to wear face masks. For example, in Vietnam, the rate is 90%, and China also very high, except Italy. These are all Asian countries. Very, very strong difference compared to other countries. And even in the early days, the US and the UK still had a very, very serious outbreak, but then only Italy had this strong mandate. And also this is from August 2020. And there is clear difference across regions in Americas versus East Asia, very, very high rate of mask wearing in Europe. And this, oh, sorry, I should have shown a full screen anyway. And another interesting difference in response, the COVID-19 responses is the stringency of government responses, such as whether government mandates closing schools, workplaces, and also canceling public events, restricting mass gatherings, or ordering at home requirements. So there are other interesting statistics, but this one, the red box, shows an interesting difference between the regions because here government responses stringency index just 30 days after the first case. Hong Kong shows the highest, the most stringent response, and also Singapore or Korea and Taiwan. Except Japan, which shows more or less the similar level of stringency like other Western countries. And testing and tracing policy is also very interesting aspect. And Asian countries tend to do more testing. And here, this one showing what was happening in January 2020. That's just the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak last year. And at the time, almost no testing policy was in place because it was just the beginning of the crisis. It was only in China, right? But then just now, June 2021, here we have almost every country, but I guess I just updated this part, but then I copied a little bit. Uh, I mean, this one just was externally copied. But then here, Asian countries, except Japan still, shows very, very strong testing policy. And I am actually writing a paper on digital contact tracing, just because Asian countries seem to be rely more actively on digital contact tracing. And Singapore is one of the first countries developing digital contact tracing technology. And this application is called Trace Together, and also Vietnam and other countries too. So early years, there were only two countries, that's China and Canada. But then now, this month, almost every country is adopting, especially Asian countries. You see mostly it's blue. So for digital contact tracing, it's actually attributed, the success of early, flattening, curve flattening in East Asia is attributed to the very, very wide use of digital contact tracing. So the question is why East Asian countries have been relying so much on digital contact tracing. There are still, of course, common concerns with digital contact tracing, especially whether this is going to have very serious implications after the COVID-19 crisis, because there are many aspects, worrisome aspects in terms of privacy violations. So some of the well-known concerns about surveillance technologies is, for example, surveillance capitalism and also digital authoritarianism. These kinds of issues have been really discussed much in among Western scholarly community, but then it's actually East Asian countries that have been very actively adopting COVID-19 contact tracing technologies, drawing on digital technologies. So the question is, it's just because Eastern countries have somewhat different cultural values, such as agreement to some common collective responses, so that they are more willing to accept stringent government responses, sometimes even at the risk of uh, uh, individual freedom. But anyway, and it could be also because of some systematic features, because East Asian countries also happen to be the countries with very, very strong infrastructure, ICT infrastructure. So it's much easier to rely on digital technologies for contact tracing. So this is just the end of my talk, but my essential idea is somehow what we are experiencing now, COVID-19 and crisis, we have been responding very differently across countries, and there may be some correlations between the two, some sort of common cultural attitudes versus how countries are developing their own responses. But these are not really random responses, but rather some systematic differences across regions or countries, part of which can be explained as some cultural variables. And that's all I have prepared. And I really look forward to discussions afterward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor So-Young Kim. It's absolutely such a delight to be able to see that there is a scientific approach to a, sort of social issue. I took back the fact that, while we assume, there's authoritarianism, and which Professor Mark Thompson will talk about, and even this whole orientation to families, your study sort of shows otherwise. But I think, therefore, you bring us to 2 points. One is that we'll need to look at Asian values in terms of the past, what we believe them to be, and what they really are now with people traveling across the world. So thank you. I think that is a nice scientific way to look at both the past and the present of Asian values. We now have our next speaker, Professor Dr. And Dr. Mark Thompson, head and professor of politics, Department of Asian and International Studies at the City University of Hong Kong. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I will unmute myself first of all and then share my screen. I think I am not allowed to share my screen yet. Somebody has to unshare.
Yes. Mute, yeah. Unmute, I don't know.
I've got it. I got it. Thank you. Thanks very much, Neha. Thank you, John, for that introduction earlier. Thanks to Professor Kim for that very interesting empirical overview, which I think is a very interesting aspect of the Asian values discussion, because there's a lot of sort of general rhetorical this is actually high rhetorics in many ways, what we'll be talking about here. So it's very interesting to see the empirical basis of it, and it's often not all that is cracked up to be or supposed to be, right? As I think your study showed. The other thing I'd say is Professor Kim mentioned she's drawing on research that is 10 years old initially. In my case, 20 years old. I first published a paper on Asian values about 20 years ago. I have continued the topic over the years, and I do have a forthcoming paper on it that this, the Asia Studies Review, that this presentation is very loosely based on, although it draws on some of that older work as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is a great idea. It's a topic that is worth discussing, and I also, Neha, like the way you framed it. Although I will be talking about East versus West, but perhaps this is also a way to move beyond it, as some people in Asia have in terms of vernacularized liberalism. So let me start out by trying to make clear what it is I'm talking about here, because these terms may seem a bit mysterious. I am talking about, on the one hand, Asian values, and Lee Kuan Yew was already mentioned. Kishore Mahbubani was cited and has been involved in other events of this organization before, very prominent scholar. And then I will be showing their rhetorical opponents and how that they critique these positions. Of course, Kishore Mahbubani's position has evolved over the years, so I'll be talking about perhaps an earlier position. But one, as Neha said, that was very famous in the 1990s. So let me begin with that. So even though there are these historical precedents, and besides the examples Neha mentioned, one important one for me is the example of Meiji Japan, which in the 19th century was the first Asian and actually the first non-Western country to modernize in the sense we understand that, industrialize, society changed rapidly. And they adopted something that can loosely be called an Asian values discourse. I won't be going into that in any detail here, but what I'm starting with is a much newer, much more recent discourse, although it picks up some of these older themes. And that was this discourse that came out of Singapore, a small city state that punches above its weight intellectually as well as financially. It has a number of well-known scholars and leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, scholar leaders we can call Lee Kuan Yew perhaps. And so this was, in a sense, the context of this Asian values discourse was an answer to Fukuyama, because Fukuyama, as you recall, was talking about the end of history, the universality of liberalism in a kind of neo-Hegelian sense. This is going to be the outcome of historical process, something that Neha was talking about at the beginning of how kind of dated that perspective is. So Lee Kuan Yew comes along and proclaims distinct Asian values that are not compatible with Western democracy and human rights, at least in the way that they're more narrowly understood in the West, propagating a kind of cultural relativism, a collectivist consensus, and government-linked intellectuals. Kishore Mahbubani, as mentioned, is a diplomat in the service of the Singaporean government. So he's a scholar, he's a very important advocate, but also closely linked to the government. So this is a discourse that was both from the government, from Lee Kuan Yew and others, but also from scholars closely linked to the government. And as mentioned, then Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad chimed in. And that, by the way, is why we're talking about Asian and not Confucian values. Lee Kuan Yew later said, I wanted to talk about Confucian values, but to be more inclusive with Muslim Malaysia, predominantly Muslim Malaysia, it was called Asian values. Mahathir, of course, underwent a bit of a conversion in this regard, having gone into the opposition and briefly served as prime minister again, taking a more democratic position. So a lot of the people I'm talking about, their positions have evolved over time. But in the 1990s, he was a forceful advocate alongside Lee Kuan Yew. And so this was a kind of justification for soft authoritarianism using a kind of indigenous cultural basis. And the interesting thing is that this discourse was taken very seriously, not just in, say, Singapore or Malaysia, but and elsewhere in Asia, but by commentators in the West. And many were arguing, particularly conservative commentators, circle around the Tory party in Britain, for example, very interested in how these conservative values seem to be linked to the Asian economic miracle, which of course some Western leaders, commentators wanted the West to have as well, as the West had seemed to fallen behind the dynamism of Asia. This was answered by a number of prominent Asian politicians, Kim Dae-jung, the most well-known, but also by academics, Amartya Sen, obviously Nobel Prize winner, very important thinker, not just in his own field of economics, but beyond it. That they pushed back against this. And already in 1994, Kim Dae-jung, as you recall, the South Korean dissident, became president, fighting against authoritarianism his whole life, almost lost his life to the Park regime. Said this is absurd. Asia is not indigenously authoritarian. We have indigenous democratic values. Amartya Sen provided an academic discussion for this, and an academic framework for this, and this is what I'm calling vernacularized liberalism. And so you have the indigenous authoritarianism. Asian cultures are authoritarian, or at least not Western liberal democratic, and answered by these other thinkers or politicians saying, no, we are. We have a liberal democratic values in Asian cultures themselves. And the argument was there are strong precedents for democracy in Asia. It's not culturally alien, and Kim Dae-jung drew on South Korean examples and Amartya Sen on Indian examples. And here I show very interesting phenomenon, something else I've been very interested in over the years. Female-led anti-dictatorship movements. Aung San Suu Kyi fought against the military junta in Myanmar for decades now, in jail again. But there are other leaders, Corazon Aquino, whose son was also Philippine president, died a couple of days ago, but also leaders of Indonesia and elsewhere, Pakistan, I could have mentioned as well, Bhutto. Anyway, these were the daughters, the widows of independence leaders, opposition heroes, leading anti-dictatorship movements against regimes that were often offering these kind of Asian values, indigenous authoritarianism kind of arguments, and they would answer them with a religious vernacular liberal reply. Aung San Suu Kyi talked about Buddhist-based democracy. Cory Aquino invoked Catholicism, calling for moral rule, democratic rule against the Marcos dictatorship. Megawati Soekarno Putri in Indonesia spoke in terms that some scholars have described as civic Islam, countering charges that they, by advocating democracy and liberalism, were being westernized. On the contrary, they were invoking religious traditions of their countries, of their regions. Now, this is where I briefly talk about this earlier research. I had studied and worked in Germany for a while, and I became very interested in kind of the parallels between a discourse that existed in the 19th century in Germany and that which was in Asia. And basically, the short version of the story is, as Germany rose as a geopolitical force in Europe in the 19th century, felt left out by the UK, by France, and saw them as Western and trying to impose liberal democratic values on Germany. And a number of famous writers were involved in this discourse as well. Thomas Mann, the famous novelist, also as late as World War I, was making this argument. We Germans are not Western. We don't accept Western civilization. We have our German culture. And if that sounds familiar, it is, because this was adapted in Meiji Japan. Now, very long story short here, the Meiji Japanese studied a lot of different Western models. They literally traveled, sent delegations to travel to these different Western countries, and ultimately chose or predominantly focused on the German or Prussian model. And there it is that they became influenced by these arguments about West versus East, of course, adapting into the Asian context, which made them more plausible, of course, because Germany was geographically within Europe. Of course, Japan was not. So you get this kind of discourse that's beginning in Meiji Japan, denouncing Western democracy as inappropriate in modernization. And the link to Lee Kuan Yew is interesting because he launched the Learn from Japan campaign in the late 70s, early 80s, as he was consolidating authoritarian rule in Singapore. And that is one way, in any way, he adapted this Confucian model. There's a scholar named Michael Baller who's explored this issue very extensively, and I won't go into detail about that, but this is one aspect. There are other aspects as well that led him to this kind of values-based justification for authoritarianism. Deng Xiaoping became obsessed with Singapore, and I've also looked at what's been called the Singapore model for China, another very interesting story. But one aspect that the Chinese were very interested in, despite, of course, the Maoist, Marxist background of the Communist Party's rule there, they thought there was room to adopt this kind of Confucian-infused discourse. And you see quite a bit of that coming in, for example, after 1989. This kind of reactionary culturalism, another term I've used, helps fill an ideological void of fading Maoism in China. Okay, so back to vernacularized liberalism. We've seen a lot of mass movements in the region. But also, of course, we saw this earlier in the anti-colonial movements, and this vernacularized liberalized discourse has been invoked. A colleague at the City University of Hong Kong has written an article about how Confucian values were invoked in this protest against Park Geun-hye in South Korea to restore good governments and stabilize democracy. Thai protests in 2020 also invoked a form of vernacularized liberalism, demanding the king serve the people, not just the narrow ruling clique. The Catholic Church has again been at the forefront of the human rights struggle against the Duterte regime in the Philippines. And of course, something that everybody has seen is how, again, Buddhist values, Buddhist monks, in fact, have been involved in the protests against the military since the coup of February there. So in conclusion, I have been suggesting Asian values discourse can be understood as a kind of claim of indigenous authoritarianism. We're different than the West. We don't have these liberal democratic values, kind of a cultural particularism that justifies the rejection of Western liberal democracy, the rejection of the idea that democracy is somehow universal, it's Western and therefore foreign or alien. Exactly this, dualism that Nea was talking about. The pushback from Asian liberals is to say no. In fact, democracy and civil liberties are highly valued in many Asian cultures, particularly in their religious traditions, properly interpreted, of course. And I talked about Amartya Sen, Kim Dae-jung, female opposition leaders, and also these recent opposition movements. One example, of course, is the Milk Tea Alliance that you saw building over the last couple of years among young, youthful protesters. So vernacularized liberalism, I suggest, remains central in these struggles against authoritarianism in the region. And on that note, I will stop, and thank you very much for your interest and attention.
Thank you, Professor. It would be very interesting to understand who held these views, who held these views of believing that authoritarianism is more peculiar to Asia than liberalism. But either way, I took 2 points and from what you said. One was the presence of government, and you referred to that several times as you spoke. So whether authoritarianism, autocratism, democracy, liberalism, illiberal democracies, whatever absolute or shades it takes in between, it seems that the presence of the state and something that also Professor So-Young Kim talked about in her presentation seems to be quite dominant in this region. And it also goes back perhaps to an Asian value, or what is perceived to be an Asian value, which is the presence or, the needing to be guided by an authority or the central position of an authority, whether in planning, whether at the time of chaos, distress, like we saw in COVID, and maybe for several reasons, we seem to go that way. Kanti Bajpai, in his latest book, Kanti Bajpai being an Indian international of Indian origin, he talks about, and also Weinstein, in his latest book, India, China, why they can't be friends, he talks about the same aspect of the presence of government being very much there, but government accountability, surprisingly, being a very sensitive litmus test in the region. And, as compared to other regions of the world, whether we believe it or not. And we will come back to that point in our discussion. So thank you very much. We'll now move on, and we have a very, I would say, a contentious issue, which is Asian values versus the battle of Asian values versus human rights, and is it relevant? And I invite Litsi Kursinkar, also founder of Asianism Retold, to take us through her thoughts. Over to you, Litsi.
Thank you, Neha. Let me just share my screen. Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with such an amazing panel of scholars. So let me start with the topic, this Asian values and human rights and a conflict between them. Is it relevant or not? I would like to start the presentation with the quote of Elizabeth Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm not reading the whole thing, just a few important lines. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet, they are the world of the individual person. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. With that, I would like to take you through the historical timeline of the conversation on Asian values and human rights. So it started with, drafting of Universal Declaration of Human Rights way back in 1948. Let's get into the details. So when Universal Declaration of Human Rights were drafted, there were many Asian representatives were very instrumental in it. At that time, Republic Party of China, currently Taiwan's Representative T.C. Chang, and Lebanon's Malik and Thailand Prince were all part of the drafting committee and who were instrumental in bringing so many values and principles into the UDHR. And 4 Asian countries had signed the UDHR at that time: China, Thailand, Philippines, and Burma. But many new Asian countries were formed after the drafting of human rights principles. So in 1955 in Bandung, many new Asian countries and African countries came together. And in that conference, they did discuss about human rights principles and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most of the countries had just earned freedom after centuries of imperialism and colonialism. So they were very excited that there is like a global codification of principles that would protect human dignity. So most of the members were enthusiastic about it, but of course there were opposition because China had just split. So People's Republic of China, which is the current communist China, was not favorable of the universal nature of human rights principle. So was North Vietnam. But otherwise, in general, universality of it was agreed. But going forward to 1990s, a few Asian countries, like Dr. Mark Thompson said, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, China, they came together and said that this universal nature of human rights principle doesn't really work for Asia, and Asian values and Asian sentiments. So they kind of proposed a review of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a time when Asia was rising financially, and generally they were kind of finding its place globally. So almost 34 Asian countries came together and signed an official Bangkok Declaration, sharing their proposals and Asian sentiments in it. Going forward, there was a World Congress on Human Rights, which is popularly known as Vienna Declaration. In that, globally, everyone underscored that universal nature of human rights principles is indeed valid, but we need to respect the cultural sentiments and cultural sentiments of all the countries. But the thing is, at that time, there was a big furore of East-West values. And there was, just like the professor shared in his presentation, there was such a big debate about Eastern values, Western values, and there are so many papers written about it. The interesting thing is, while Asian leaders kind of proposed this Asian concept of human rights, most of the civil society organizations in Asia opposed it. They did not agree that human rights are not universal. Now, going forward to late 90s, this conversation around Asian values started waning, primarily because of the Asian financial crisis, and Indonesian Suharto government had collapsed by that. Now, what exactly is this Asian value concept that they were proposing? There were a few main themes. One was, as I discussed, universal nature of human rights principles versus cultural relativism of various regions. Another was individual rights versus communitarianism, as Dr. Kim had mentioned in her presentation. Then they also thought economic, social, and cultural rights should take precedence over civil and political rights. A duty-based approach versus right-based approach. And there was an emphasis on national sovereignty, non-interference, and self-determination. Let's take a look at it in detail. Now, as I mentioned, human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was kind of created in the background of, post-World War time and after the Nazi regime. So it was very important for the global representatives to make sure that human dignity is protected. And in order to do that, that natural rights was kind of shared as an inalienable, indivisible, and universal. So that anybody, irrespective of their background or laws around them, these rights were kind of considered sacred and enforceable in some sense for all human beings. However, in Bangkok Declaration, the Asian leaders kind of pointed out that there can be international norm setting and we kind of respect universality, but it has to be set in the light of national and regional peculiarities, historical, religious, and cultural backgrounds. Specifically, they were kind of not supportive of the liberal democracy of the West. So the contention was that there are pluralistic alternatives of governance, like China and the communist government, and so many other kinds of systems are available, and that needs to be respected. Now, the second theme was like individual rights versus communitarianism. As we all know, Asians, we tend to be more family oriented and we are very community centric. But if you look at, global rights, it's based on individuals. So the contention was that, Asian values are a little different. Individuals are taken as a part of the whole, which is family, society, and state, and so on. So when there is such an emphasis on individual rights, that community-centric sentiments that Asians value are not kind of really respected. But if you really look at Article 29 of UDHR, you can see that everyone has duties to the community, in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. It was actually incorporated in it. Duty-based approach versus right-based approach. It's very similar to the previous one, but deriving from Confucianism, there was a lot of emphasis on duty, respect, obedience. And there was an emphasis that individuals are duty holders than rights holders. But essentially, they were saying that states are the guardians of citizens and challenging the state is not encouraged because of the hierarchical traditions and values Asians hold. Again, economic, social, and cultural rights, they thought, should precede civil and political rights. Again, they kind of focused on selective things from Confucianism. One can only learn if one is fed. Poverty is always an obstacle to enjoy human rights. That is true in some way, but at the same time, prioritizing economic development more than political rights, not sure if that is really valid. And Amartya Sen, the famous economist and philosopher, really contested it, saying that for economic development, what we need is a conducive economic environment. not absence of freedom and rights. And he's given like so many examples of how it is not statistically evident that economic development and freedom and rights have any correlation. The interesting thing is that the state leaders who proposed economic, social, and cultural rights never ratified this covenant until late 1998, despite proposing it. Asian civil society was really bringing out the fact that most of the economic, social, and cultural rights, which are essentially trade union rights and right against discrimination and so on, were not practiced in those countries. Now, what are the main challenges to Asian values concept? Professor Thompson has already taken care of the thing that cultural relativism is used to justify authoritarianism. And they selectively use Confucianism. Confucianism does not really propose authoritarianism all the time. It has various sentiments where they ask people to kind of stand up against authority and so on. But the selective institutional Confucianism was used by Asian value proponents to justify authoritarianism. And Confucianism does not represent heterogeneous political and religious philosophies of Asia. Asia is so unique with diverse religions, philosophies. And one thing about Asian is we know how to coexist. Whether there are disagreements or agreements, whether there are different values, we always see these different philosophies and religions existing together. So again, another stereotype of Asian value is that human rights are essentially Western and not really Asian, which is not true. If you look at it, Western ideals mainly came from Renaissance and Enlightenment, as stated by Amartya Sen in his paper. But if you look at the history of Asia, we were kind of always advocating for lofty ideals like tolerance, nonviolence, compassion, personal freedom, and so on. Aristotle is often kind of seen as a person talking about freedom, but he was talking about freedom of the upper echelons of the society. Slaves existed, women didn't have equal power, so there were no equality of freedom, according to Amartya Sen in his paper. If you look at that way, even in Asia, upper caste or the privileged, like Brahmins in India or Mandarins in China, always had that, always valued personal freedom, but there was no equality of freedom across different sectors. Now, in order to conclude, what I would like to say is, Asian values and human rights do not have to be mutually exclusive. Take good things from both, and let's have just like Neha said in her beginning, we can coexist. We don't have to make it a dichotomy. Cultural relativism shouldn't justify human rights violations. But just like, Myanmar protest shows, they're using Buddhist liberal values against military coup, or the South Korean example that Professor Mark Thompson shared here. So we can use our cultural for a better good and an implementation of human rights. At the same time, the universalism should not homogenize the cultural identity, just like Neha shared in her. We have our identity and we should kind of explore and realize it fully. Again, the community-centric Asian values could balance excessive individualism. During COVID crisis, we saw how US and UK couldn't really handle it as if COVID as effectively as many Asian countries, just like Dr. So-Young Kim showed in her study. So there can be a balance, and political rights and economic development should be balanced as well. Like Hong Kong is highly developed economically, yet there are so many protests for political rights. Like Chile, in a Pinochet regime, they actually kind of handle economic mess very effectively, but it ended up in total chaos and dictatorship. So what we have to do was really balance both. Now, modernism among Asian youth shows much more amalgamation to get something from the West and retain some of that Asianism. So that hybrid model, that would be better than kind of going for a dichotomy. Again, principle of non-interference. In this globalized world, it may be a little tricky to do that. we need mutual interdependence while retaining our identity. So I really hope Asian values can contribute positively towards human rights while retaining its universality and while retaining its identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Litsi. That was a very comprehensive presentation for a very broad and contentious topic, like I said. You make a very interesting point, which is that, you know, a lot of Asian countries were formed after the declaration was signed, and they did see this whole opposition to human rights as being more of the West. And, you know, it carried
Neha, we can't hear you.
Joe Biden, as he
you got cut off for a while. Maybe you can repeat that. If you get cut off again, I'll just transfer to Dr. Nabi if that's okay. But try going ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to take that as an indication that you do not want to hear me, and it and it was really a lapse of technology. But what I was really saying was that I was struck by Litsi's point on an interesting one that she makes, that a lot of Asian countries were formed after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was sort of drafted, but you know, we know that the opposition to human rights came also because of they saw it as a Western ideological domination on the region, and that it carried the baggage of that, which exists even now, you know, after, for instance, after the G7 meeting, like I was saying, the communique from Joe Biden as he offers financial infrastructure to the developing world is quoted and marketed in the cover of saying that we are going to provide a democratic alternative to what China provides. So there's always this value battle. And of course, we know that the whole aspect on human rights has many double standards. You know, even the declaration on torture, against torture, despite the Asian countries being formed, you have 141 countries, signatories of that convention, who still practice torture. I think the more valuable point that I take away from what you said, Litsi, was that really human rights has got to be a marriage between what happens at the international level in terms of international conventions, what happens at the level of national laws, but also at the level of social ethics, community ethics, and what, you know, particular society looks at a particular time. And it's got to be a marriage of that. Now, how do we make it possible for that marriage to take place, for that that play to happen constantly, for that interaction between these three layers to happen constantly, and kind of set a system for that process? So hopefully we'll take that up in the discussion section, and we'll move on to our very famous speaker, Professor and again Dr. Rafiqul Nabi from Bangladesh, an artist and cartoonist, former Dean of Fine Arts at the University of Dhaka. It's an honor to have you, Professor and Dr. Nabi. Over to you.
Hi, Professor. I think you're on mute. Maybe you can try unmuting yourself. Okay, go ahead.
So thank you very much. I was listening to others, and they were so, expert on Asian things, which I am not at all. I'm an artist and cartoonist. So, whatever I see, I just count it as very lightly. I take all these things anyway. So before I say about my tokai, it was mentioned in the, I think in Neha's paper, before I say about my Tokai, the cartoon series, I want to tell two true stories which I always remember as important incidents I had in my life. I think a bit relevant, maybe, because the values and all these things we are talking about Asia. Both were about my identity as an Asian. And since then on, I have become conscious enough to think that whatever I do in my work should have the Asian essence well kept in my works. The first one was in 1973. You know, I'm a senior citizen now, so it should be. I got the opportunity to go to Athens for higher studies in fine art under Greek government's postgraduate scholarship. That was my first visit in some European country at that time. So as usual, I was very much excited and overwhelmed and tried to change my own style of work and subjects of paintings and started the European way. The artists and other students praised my work and they liked my works by everybody except my very serious professor. His name was Mr. Grammatopoulos, was very famous artist in Europe and as well as, of course, in Greece. He was expert in woodcut prints. I think everybody knows what is woodcut prints, like etchings and card lithographs like this. So he was expert in woodcut prints. He one day told me that works which I used to do before, when I brought some from my country, those were very good and showed him that time were very good and interesting. Those had the Oriental flavors. He didn't like my intention to mix the Western trends in works and ignoring the Eastern things and qualities. He told me that he was fond of Chinese, Japanese, and Indian art. And he himself was influenced as those were so unique, as he told me. Hokusai, Monakata of Japan, Chinese scroll Shunga paintings, and India's Mughal styles of painting or Kangra Vasuli paintings. He was very much fond of these things. But what his thinking was that why I was changing all these things, forgetting all Eastern things and trying to get the Western, trends and styles and all this in my works. So those were like, anyway, those were like for me, eye-opening words of my professor for me, and I came back to my own style again. I had to. The second incident happened in Mexico during early of this century. I was invited by the organizers, French and Mexican workers' parties, to attend a mock tribunal as one of the 7 judges. It was very interesting for me, and these judges were of different professions, and I was one of them. Being an artist, I was to judge things. Subjects were child labor, child abuses, child survivals, and child development. And after mock trials, verdicts were declared in a huge courtroom, which was actually an auditorium and fully crowded, and the crowd was the participant audience. The representatives from all continents were present. Some real barristers were the prosecutors. Many countries of different continents, including USA, were accused. This mock court verdict was to create awareness among the accused countries, companies, and persons. It was a big event because I never saw any court like that, but I was one of the participants of that. Anyway, the reason I became overwhelmed with joy, I was there to represent as one of the Asian judges, as they say. They introduced me. The organizers introduced us, those who were from, many of us were from Asian countries. So that way they introduced us. Of course, name of our countries were mentioned too later. So whatever we do, wherever we go, we are counted as Asians, and I personally feel proud for it. So still I feel that those two incidents made me think about Oriental dignity, identity, the name of which is Asian. Even as a cartoonist and as an artist, painter and printmaker of our country, whatever I do or practice is my own. Whatever I do is mine. The styles are my own. But it is said that my connoisseurs and some experts that my subjects, objects, which I try to depict in my works, either in cartoons or in my artworks, can be meant for some other countries of Asia also. Because we are all Asians and things are almost same as they say. Maybe they are correct, for I have also noticed that some countries are having the same problems. Especially the problems are social anomalies or the socio-political aspects and odd situations created by these. We know that so many problems we face in our countries are common. Poverty is the oldest one in those. Well, I have a cartoon character named Tokai, who is a small boy from a poor, destitute, and socially downtrodden family. Passes the whole day regularly on the streets, watches people of many types, many sections of the society, answers the different and unusual questions. Well, to make this character talk, I include always one or two question makers in my frame. Yes. Tokai answers innocently, but those become meaningful all the time somehow. Not only human beings, birds, animals, even the insects also ask questions about politics, universe, crime, economy, world leaders, health, disease, poverty, etc. And as characters, their own values in the society and the environment. Of course, the answers are not funny or jokes. Rather, those are ironic in expressions. One may find some innocent humors in the dialogues or comments, never abuses any individual. I mean, Tokai never abuses any individual or anybody. These are my techniques and styles of semi-strip Tokai. Anyway, as a cartoonist, I have noticed while working on Tokai that countries of Asia are developing very fast in many fields: education, science, industries, sports, fine arts, etc. Some Asian countries have become powerfully developed in every way that they are competing the so-called big powers of the world. These countries are now almost big powers of Asia, but many of their neighbors are having poverty like their other heritage objects. I guess that this could not be eliminated, this poverty could not be eliminated because of wrong political and economic systems. Not knowing anything, ignorant Tokai become sufferer everywhere. Tokai like this section, this society we make. Tokai is not like famous strips like Dennis the Menace or Peanuts or Nancy or Doraemon of Japan or Charlie Brown, not like those characters. These characters are of well-off families, we know. but the idea of my talk I taken from realities of 70s and 80s of our country of last century. But the truth is that this reality never changed. In fact, the poor sections got habituated with these realities of life. And it is true that not only the two words, rich and poor, are enough to recognize the social categories and status. There are more steps in between these. And the steps are new micro-factions growing and taking place in these. If we look at the rich, on the top are giants of the richest. They are unreachable riches, very giants. Then the usual rich, and after this, the semi-riches of the upper middle class. Then the original middle class of the society. People of these steps or groups are usually ambitious. They think they can fit themselves in any position of the society, and to tell the truth, they do. They do it. This group is followed by the nearing middle class, another one, who are just promoted from lower middle class. In poor groups also there are fractions like poor, extreme poor, and then the poorest of all, helpless, hopeless, destitute group. So every step has its own social periphery and environment. Norms of life of each step are different than any of those upper ones. Well, these are my observations and findings, which are the subjects of my Tokai semi-street cartoon series. I think these steps flourished by the long systems taken to govern or rule the countries by the rulers. And we know that in Asia, many types of systems exist and practiced to rule the countries. There are kingdoms. I'm talking about the Asian practices. Kingdoms, there are army-ruled or fascist-type rulers. There are socialisms, and of course, in some countries, democracy is there. Many of these countries were the colonies of some European countries. So in some systems, influences of European colonies are still followed. Feudal thoughts and ideas taught by the colonial rulers still exist in those Asian countries. In fact, heritage-loving people of Asian countries are always art and culture oriented and have great weaknesses for their past traditional things. There are other serious reasons which create social problems. These are involvement in war and territorial conflicts, regional conflicts, political conflicts, and religious conflicts between some countries of Asia. And it is noticed that some countries of Europe and USA involved to have the benefits. Tokai does not miss the opportunities to comment on these subjects. Those are the things I do in my cartoons named Tokai. So Tokai or doing cartoons is not my only practice. Painting, drawing, and woodcut prints are my other fields as an artist. So I know a bit about the art world of Asia. Of course, it is known by all that the world of art and culture of Asian countries are very rich and very much different than the other countries. The unique styles, techniques, trends, use of materials of different time since ancient eras are of separate values. Though these were not identical in terms of characteristics on all the countries in Asia in early days. Many differences were there. But later, the art and culture scenarios were changed when three powerful areas established themselves as the most dominating parts in Asia. Those are Indian subcontinent, China, and Arabs, including Persia. All of these areas influencing each other in art and culture, science, literature, etc. And we can see the sculptures also architecture. Their dominating powers of religious preaching, Hindu, Buddhist, and Slavic styles influenced and mixed with each other. These became the heritage of these countries, and even now, the people feel happy and proud for the past traditional values of heritages and own cultures. But in modern time, if we count it from 19th century, the artists, literators, scientists of different countries of Asia had been trying to modernize their works. But these were isolated and regional practice, ignoring the integration. In early 20th century, two very important personalities of Asia, as well as of the world, Indian great Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore and the famous Japanese scholar Okakura. Ms. Neha was telling about Okakura's, things, thinking about this identity of Asian identity, I think, so far I remember. Emphasized the importance of Asian art and culture to the modern world. Both of them fought to protect the traditional art forms of their respected countries. They thought to establish the Asian identity in art and culture. Both of them established education. For that, both of them established educational institution. Okakura's institute's name was Hall of Fine Arts in Tokyo, I think. And Tagore's were the Vishwabharati Shantiniketan. It was that these two things were done by these two big personalities. Some years later, the noted artist of Bengal in India, Shilpacharya Abanindranath Tagore, who took the initiative to use the Chinese-style wash media in his watercolor painting, and invented a new dimension in the field of Indian art. Maybe some may ask that only artists, they know it. Of course, we the artists, we know it, but others also, the art lovers, they know it. The Western world has named it Oriental art. This word was not given, this Oriental word is not, I found that it was given by us, the Asians. It was brought from the Western world anyway. Anyway, now at present, of course, things have changed due to global era. The unique development in science and technology have placed world almost in one platform. We are now
Dr. Nabi,
on the one platform, maybe. Now the thoughts, ideas, inventions, practices, styles, trends, etc. of countries of all continents can be watched from anywhere of the world. Well, whatever is happening globally in the name of development, I hope our own Asian identities will not be disturbed. Keeping these in mind, we in Bangladesh have been organizing Asian Biennale since 1981. Through these, we, the Asians, come closer and see each other's works. So this much I could say in short, because this vast subject, this Asia, this Asian values, and all Asianism are very difficult for an artist to explain. Thanks to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nabi. Even though you keep apologizing for being an artist and using a very simple voice, you've left us with so many thoughts. The one thing that many will be struck by is your call for retaining the Asian arts. But as you say that, the other thing that many would be struck by is the fact that Dhaka, Delhi, 2,000 kilometers away, we've been able to trade and smuggle fish, human beings, children, but not our stories. So like you say, Dennis the Menace, Charlie Brown comes to us very easily, but Tokai, I only heard about it when I was in touch with you for this roundtable, which I think is a huge miss. And hopefully we have to find a way for our stories to cross borders now. I think the time has come. The second bit that you talk about is something that, about your individual expression. We've heard in the previous, in the roundtable so far, that individualism is something not considered Asian. But so that individual expression,
Neha, sorry, it seems we lost Neha. Oh, Neha, you're back. Go ahead.
I was really saying, the second point that struck me about Dr. Nabi's talk was about individualism, which we disregard or we don't think exists in Asia. But as an artist, that individual expression is so important. It's given enough room, despite confines or traditions of art schools, art cultures, and like I said, traditions of art in Asia. But the one point that I take away is what you said. I feel proud to be an Asian, and hopefully the next generation should also feel proud of being an Asian. And we've got to think about what are those values. But I want to quote here another artist, Dr. Rustam Barucha, who's also a playwright, a person from theatre, and he teaches at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. And he's written another book called Another Asia. And there he says that as an artist, I was always, different ideas, or the idea of Asia was imposed upon me. He takes another take and he says that, for me, I found it very difficult to find a place for that Asian idea and value in the juggle of many other identities that I was actually facing and going through, which is, language or gender or ethnicity, nationality, etc. And then he goes on to make another point, which I think I also took back from what you said, which is that this whole idea of Asia will be used by different countries differently and for different purposes, or disregarded for different reasons. And I know Pana has a question on that, but we'll come to that later. But the fact that there are countries in Asia, and he takes the example of Singapore, who didn't really have a culture of their own or an artist base as strongly as maybe another country, even including Bangladesh. And so they use the Asian value discourse much more strongly than other countries. So thank you very much for that. Those very sort of triggering us in many directions. With that, I want to now invite our discussant for this evening, Dr. Shahab Inam Khan, professor at the Jahangir University, just one introduction to him apart from many others, to sort of respond to all the different ideas that have come up on the table today. But just to sum up, say that we started off by saying that let's not look at it in a West versus East way. Let us look at it also for the fact that we don't have a vocabulary, to look at it not as a pan-Asian way. Then we had Professor Soyoung Kim, who talked about that there is the future and there is the past, and the future is telling us different things about the Asian values and what that is. What is communalism? Dr. Mark Thompson and Litzy spoke about Asian values and the sort of notion of it, whether in the form of government, authoritarianism versus liberalism, in human rights, individualism versus society. So there is a notion of Asian values and culture, presence of state, and of course, Dr. Nabi, who talks about the need to retain it as artists and the individual expression and so on. But the point really is that, as we sort of think about this, how do we really think Asian? How do we really get ourselves to think more coherently about this? So over to you, Professor Khan.
Thank you very much, Neha. I thank you very much for your introduction. And I was listening to the esteemed panelists, and I was only gaining. Probably I have nothing to give. And I would like to start with Professor Afikunobi. And I grew up with Tokai, and Tokai was born in the same time when I was born. So back in 1978, Tokai was born. Am I right, sir? That was the exact time when he was born. And when I was a child, so my mother used to do the tailoring. So, you know, when you get the, when you're doing the tailoring, there are wastes. So my job was to collect those wastes. So since then, my name at the home was Tokai. So I grew up as Tokai at our house too. So you can literally, I can literally link myself with Tokai. And I never knew that Tokai is basically Bangladeshi, but essentially I used to link Tokai with the global phenomena as a movement. And in fact, I teach Tokai at international relations as one of the icon to make understand people, the class and class stratification system. And perhaps in one of the Children's Day program, where Professor Nobi was saying about Tokai, that what is this thing about Tokai, when he said the only wish that Tokai has is that one day he will grow up soon. So I like that particular statement, and I was telling my students that be Tokai and grow up sometimes. So that also gives you a statement of a system where you belong. And with that statement, let me get back to the whole discussion that we had. As Mark has rightly mentioned, this is all about high rhetorics, but certainly this high rhetorics comes with a very concrete structure of identity in which we have lucidity as well as we have hybridity as well. I mean, even if you look at the whole composition of the identity structure that I come from, the Bangladeshis or the Bengali, or you come from the Indian, or even if you call yourself as Gujarati or Punjabi, or even Mark himself or Litsi herself. So all these identities are no longer an individual identity, rather a multipolar identity. But is it so? When I look back, recently I wrote an article about COVID-19 and how it is linked with our identity of being Bengali or an Indian, or perhaps being anybody in that matter. So I looked into the whole ecosystem of the creation of the cognitive resonance, or perhaps the logical argument of being a Bangladeshi or Bengali, or perhaps a South Asian. Now, when we looked into that, I was looking into one classic example of political and social memories of famine. And when I looked into these famines of 1770, 1876, or even 1943, very interestingly, all these famines happened during the British time. So that was the colonial time, and which Amartya Sen, who was a professor at Harvard, was linking or telling that, look, at that time, the famine happened not because that there was a lack of food, rather there was people didn't know where the food is. So which means that the institutions that came with the colonial system, which replaced the existing indigenous system, really became a problem. And the second level, when the second famine came in 1876, which Davies was saying that equated it with the Victorian Holocaust. And when he said that, look, the British administration was more busy with their own interest rather than really producing food this time. And when the 1943 famine came, and Dalrymple was more talking about, look, it was the taxation, or Clive's taxation policy, tariff policy, hoarding policy. These things started to come, and obviously that came with the smallpox and in Murshidabad, so and so. So that says that the colonial institutions that we inherited in South Asia didn't really work very well that time. That means, again, Shashi Tharoor goes on and says that the Brits should pay us for reparation for all these menace. But certainly, I'm not blaming anybody, but rather what I'm saying that the whole indigenous idea of the institutions and all indigenous idea of the structure, social structure was being contaminated, because when the colonial powers came, didn't understand what values mean. But again, if you look at the whole thing of the Mughal Empire that came, right? Again, Mughal was much more of a foreigner. I mean, in a sense, like one Turco-Mongol prince, Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, who came to India back in 1529, created a new system. And in that, you saw for the first time a Perso-Islamic influence over the socio-legal systems. And that also being carried out over the period of time. So you had a new model of imperial authority, which essentially had some sort of in line with the whole system that we had in earlier system, which was more of a quasi-authoritarianism. And quasi-authoritarianism was a reflection of the social hierarchy. Even if you look at the Hinduism, if you look at the other religion that was prevailing in the whole structure of the Indian civilization that time. Now, what does it mean? It means that you had a multi-layered structure in which you had a different type of individual and actors working in a different level, in which you had a different kind of actors influencing another actors, in which, again, even if we look at the question of secularism, and I was looking into this whole secular idea, whether when the Mughals came, or prior to the Mughals, when the Hindus stayed there, or the Buddhists stayed there, whether the state was secular. And the very idea of secularism, when the Brits brought that idea of secularism in the Indian subcontinent, the whole idea of secularism never adjusted within the system. Now, why it didn't work out very well in the Indian subcontinent? The very simple reason is the ecosystem was much more in line with what Mark was talking about is authoritarianism. And perhaps that authoritarianism continued to be a part of the social hierarchy and the governance. And that created the whole idea of the identity in South Asia. Even if you look at the Bollywood, even if you look at the South Indian movies, even if you look at the whole genesis of the creation of the vernacular idea of identity, where you essentially see that whole idea of power retains, and power is always there in the movies as well. That means the society had some sort of resort into the power structure in which you had the family, in which the family had a hierarchical system, which again contradicts what Mahathir was trying to endorse in terms of its Asianism, his Asian values. Henceforth, even if you look at the whole religious makeup, and Asia comes with a different religious system. And even if you look at the Buddhism coming to Hinduism, and then you have the Abrahamics coming in, Confucianism, you're talking about Taoism, you're talking about Zionism and stuff. And then the problem remains is whether we can really develop some sort of universal understanding, universalism, as Litsi was talking about, universalism in terms of the governance, in terms of institutions in this particular landmass. And that's the reason often we talk about the governance. Even when the colonials came, today, if you implement that particular question in terms of Durand Line, in terms of McMahon Line between China and India, remains as a problematic, because the Chinese never accepted the colonial idea of border. So is the Indians to a great extent. So therefore, the whole political understanding of the West versus the Eastern idea of the politics remain conflicting, because you have a completely different family orientation leading to different kind of hierarchy, in which you have a matriarchal design as well as the patriarchal design. Even if you take the art, as Professor Nobi was talking about, even the art, the very basis of art. Even if you look at the old, the Chinese art, the Japanese art, or even South Asian art, we have less abstract, more into spiritual side of life, nature, religious imagery, woodblock, which Professor Nobi has specialized on, even dyeing fabrics. So even if you look at these sort of lineages, that also depicts the importance of human agencies rather than institutions to a great extent. Now, I was having a very fascinating dialogue with Shashi Tharoor a few years back, and subsequently with Ramila Thapar. And one of the agenda came up that what's the difference between the Mughals and the Brits back in time. Both of them had navies, but the only difference was that the Mughals used, or the Chinese used that time, the navy for the trade. Only the British knew that how to install a cannon on that. So that made the whole difference. So therefore, the whole concept of security also different back in time. So therefore, the whole idea of human security was quite different. As a result, when we talk about multilateralism to a great extent, remains problematic for Mahathir, remains problematic for the Chinese and the Japanese. And the Japanese value system, when you talk about aggression, the whole idea and the concept of aggression and human security and human development is fundamentally different. I mean, now that we have a liberal system that we are talking about, and Mark is once again right, that vernaculized liberalism stays. Even if you look at, he was talking about Suki, even if you talk about Chandrika Kumaratunga, Sonia Gandhi, or even Benazir, Indira Gandhi, all the family lineages. And these family lineages essentially brought most of the female leaderships come to the power. And in that case, even is that the family leadership or the family lineages bringing female to the leadership essentially changed the gender composition? No, it was the organic process that has changed, not necessarily having female as in the leadership in Asia has changed the face of the. Even if you look at the Chinese in Japan, how the gender parity. Even if you look at the gender mainstreaming in South Asia, gender mainstreaming in China is completely different. And again, that has something to do with the state and how state sees the family value system. Another important factor, again, going back to the religion, again, that comes to Litz's point. I mean, even if you compare between the religion of Islam and religion of Hinduism, Hinduism sees life as a cycle. I mean, it creates a cycle of life. In Islam, it is a linear process. And hence, the very idea of the social system, social ecosystem is fundamentally different. So therefore, when you come up with the idea of secularism doesn't really work. The best thing that can come is literally the pluralism. That is the reason in many cases, the very basic of secularism, I often contest by saying, okay, this is absolutely workable in a neo-Abrahamic interpretation of the religious plurality in the Western post-Enlightenment society. But when we are still struggling whether South Asia or Asia has actually emerged or transited from colonial or post-colonial time. Even sometimes I also discuss about the whole concept of death, even because death is a fundamental idea for every human being. And particularly in South Asia, it makes a lot of difference in terms of creating a social fabric and social understanding of your ultimate goal. So whenever you ask somebody, essentially the concept of death that determines how you're going to think about your future. Even look at Veda, look at Mahabharata, and Yudhishthira is talking about it. And I love this particular quote when Yudhishthira is saying that death, each day death strikes us, but we live as though we were immortal. This is the greatest wonder. Now, why is he saying that? Essentially, he's saying that, look, the very fundamental philosophy of human being lies in the understanding of the spiritual existence. And that's where the Chinese comes in. Even if you look at the Chinese painting, look at the Chinese poetics, if you look at the Indian paintings, Indian poetics, essentially that determines that how the societal fabric is there. Go back to the Arab and the Persians, go back to the Arab and the Ottomans, and that is very important in understanding South Asia too. Again, when the Turco-Mongol Prince Babur came to South Asia, before that, they had this amalgamation, and this amalgamation lies with the future of Ottoman that you have seen later on. Now, the Persians never equate themselves with the Arabs, and the Arabs would never like to go and say that we have an asymmetry with the Persians, but again, they'll belong to the same landmass. That's the same thing happening in the new Ottomans, which is again Erdogan's Turkey. So therefore, again, you're now seeing that the reinforcement of what you have seen back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, once again coming back. The paradox is you have the technology, paradox is you have the globalization, but on the other hand, you're also seeing the rise of ethno-nationalism once again coming back. Now, why is this happening? The essential is the social system has some inadequacy in accepting the changes that was supposed to be ingrained with the growth that was supposed to take place over the period of time. That's the paradox. So therefore, the South Asia, whether we call it's South Asia or Asianism or South Asianism or the Orientalism, as Professor Nobi has rightly mentioned, that even the Orientalism, that the concept that we are talking about is essentially Western inherently. Again, when I go back, very interestingly, in COVID, inherently, I come from quite a society where you have a predominantly Islam to rule. And for the first time, when Kuwait and Saudi Arabia stopped praying prayers in the mosques, we continued. So we again became the holier than the Pope. So that again gives me a thought that then the whole perception that, okay, we have always historically followed the center of religion, is no longer there suddenly. So there is an awakening. So there is a revitalization of our realization that we have our own individuality, because we haven't been going to the pilgrimage, not before 15th century or 16th century. People went to Mecca not before 16th century. So therefore, now that gap comes back. So again, sometimes in politically, I say, are we going back to the pre-Westphalian system once again? So again, the dichotomies, paradoxes are coming back. The conflicts are coming back. Individualism is trying to make a comeback, but at the end of the day, the family and the value system remains. So I would certainly say, as the last note, as I go back to Professor Kim as well, that yes, there are the identity caveats over there. There is change, although this is a 10 years data, but I think Professor Kim, that data still is valid. And certainly what I'm seeing is that whole narrative of identity, the whole narrative of creating of individualism, or perhaps what Mark would say, that the liberals or post-liberal society still remains as a very nuanced state. Even if I take the Korean society, even if I take the Singaporean society, development has taken at the vernacular level without any doubt. Science has advanced, society has advanced, but essential institutions, society as a family as an institution, and hierarchy as the driver of the institution continues. As a result, the authoritarianism, whether it is in a quasi-system whether it is whether it in a very nuanced way will continue to be there. Even if you look at India, you look at Bangladesh, Pakistan, still the politics is determined by some sort of families, whether in a discrete way, whether in an open way. So that's going to be there. And the political decisions and the social decisions and economic decisions will continue to be influenced by how the families will interact with the social systems and the institutional systems that the state would belong. So therefore, again, going back to the whole class stratification and the class system, as Professor Nabi's Tokai aptly says, that the Tokai remains and the whole Tokai phenomena will continue to remain in the South Asian system, whether we take it as a symbol of deprivation, whether we take it as a symbol of the social class system, whether we take it as a symbol of society itself in which the institution and the human agencies will continue to conflict and differ. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nabi, Professor Khan, sorry. Absolutely. I think Dr. Shashi Tharoor talks about the battle of belonging between this ethno-nationalism and civic nationalism, which we're seeing not just in India, but across the region. And as you say, pluralism, is really what we are going to be dealing with. We talked about many things, but the one thing perhaps that I would say is, I don't know whether we would see it as going back or perhaps as a containment of the past and the present. So, a place where you have what you call modernity, but also a place for all these other aspects, whether you talk about, different shades of authoritarianism, the fact that religion will still play an important role, interpretations on spiritual interpretations on different aspects, including death. The question really will therefore now be for us as Asia is that how do we keep these two tracks aligned? How do we keep them going together? How do we marry these two together as we think about Asian values, both what we consider modern and what we considered traditional, or in a way, as you said, going back. But very, very interesting thoughts. With that, since we are also running out of time, we have about 15-20 minutes. I want to
add something to that, Neha, if it is okay. I mean, I might sound a little sarcastic. I think one thing that can keep us tied, I mean, if we think Asia divided into two parts, East and West, because West will always keep us tied in terms of biryani, and East will keep us tied in terms of chopsticks, because we have the biryani in different forms from Turkey to all the way to Bangladesh, only that the flavor will vary. But chopsticks design will only vary in East Asia. That's the only commonalities I see.
Well, yes, I think the next person who's wanting to ask a question from the audience is pretty much along those lines. So I'm going to ask Pana to ask his question, and if you can just make it brief. And I think we'll leave all speakers to respond to this question that Pana asks. Over to you, Pana. Okay, is Pana still on the line? Can you unmute yourself and tell us which country you belong to and ask your question, please?
Yes, Pana from Asia News Network. I'm based in Bangkok. Just want to ask, how do you see the community, the BIMSTEC community or ASEAN community that has come together over the years? Of course, ASEAN have made more progress than BIMSTEC, but whether the value that the two groups are able to come together, how would you assess that compared to the North Asia, where there's a historical conflict between Korea, Japan, and China? So they weren't able to work together, but they have come to join, particularly ASEAN as dialogue partners and try to mold into the community. Does these two community BIMSTEC and ASEAN have particularly value that you would be called that emerge over the years? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to leave it open to all speakers to respond to that. Basically, if I understand, this is a question to ask about what Dr. Khan was saying, you know, the difference between the East and the West, East Asia and West Asia, and the difference in value systems. But may I also add, you know, also the different value systems that are happening at a country level and how that sort of sits with values that are sitting at the regional level. So over to each speaker to respond to that question, please. Anybody who would like to go first, and maybe what we could do is that we could go in the order of those who spoke first. So Professor So-Young Kim, would you like to go first?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand this question correctly, but there was some comment that China, Japan, and Korea have had a lot of conflict, which has been no question over the last few years, especially Korea and Japan had a very, very, as everybody knows, very sad history during the World War II. So my take on this question is, compared to other sub-regions of Asia, for example, South or Southeast Asia or West Asia, probably outsiders of East Asia might think that there's a lot more commonality among these three countries, essentially having the same, more or less the same Confucian tradition. We share the Chinese character system, at least in terms of the written language. So even if we cannot understand Chinese, for instance, I'm a South Korean, but even if I don't understand the Chinese or Japanese, still I can read most of the characters when I just walk on the street in China or in Japan. So there's a very strong sense of at least the cultural heritage coming from this common written language system. But still somehow in the 20th century, we had very, very volatile, very, very violent history among three nations. So contemporary politics, I think, among these three countries is very heavily influenced by that history. So although there are a lot of commonalities among these three countries, and also in terms of economic growth, you know, both Japan and South Korea grew very, very fast, and also China following up also very fast. But still, there are lots of disagreements and conflicts within the region, especially for South Korea. We are straddled between the two countries, and there has always been a struggle for securing both security, because we are facing the North Korean threat, and also the securing continuous growth in China catching up with South Korea very fast. So that's just my first thought on this question. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. If Professor Mark Thompson, if you could respond to that. I think, I mean, if I could just say very quickly, the question really is about what Dr. Khan left us with, is that, you know, there is pluralism, you know, we know in the region, but there is differences in values between the East and the West of Asia, the North and the South of Asia, between different countries of Asia. How are we going to, how are we going to look at that? And then what Pana also asks is also that there is the geopolitics of the region, which is going to perhaps prevent us from sitting together to understand that. So how would you respond to that, Professor Thompson?
Yeah, I think along similar lines to what you were saying, perhaps one other thing worth adding is, as Professor Kim was discussing, World War II is still very much a sore point, not just in Northeast Asia. Let's keep in mind Southeast Asia was also very much impacted by World War II. memories are still there of the atrocities committed. Of course, perhaps not to the extent as in China and the persistence of the concerns in China and South Korea, for example. But we shouldn't forget that the imperialist war, if we can call it that, of the Japanese was done in the name of Pan-Asianism. We shouldn't forget that. Yeah. There was a Pan-Asian ideology. And I think one of the reasons that this ideology sort of got discredited is because, we talked about the ambivalence of Japanese thinkers, thinking maybe they'd embrace the West and then saying, no, we're going to just embrace the techniques of the West. Then a very strong view became, we are kind of the leaders of Asia. We're the most advanced, we're the most modern, and we're going to bring a co-prosperity zone. Of course, it was done with violence and it discredited it. So that's one interesting kind of footnote on the history of Pan-Asianism is World War II. About ASEAN itself, I would say that is, of course, a very important and interesting project. A lot of people argue ASEAN is much more effective than Westerners generally realize. But just one point on that, it's the non-interference idea that's at the core of ASEAN, showed up in the Myanmar coup, right? So the organization refused to be outright condemn it. And that was different than in Africa, where there was a coup in Mali and African states said, no, we don't accept that. So, the non-interference, which is also based indirectly on this sense that, each country has its own views and values and political systems and so on, does run up against issues like what happens when you have a coup like in Myanmar.
Thank you. Litsi, would you like to go next?
Hi. So I like the question that a comparison of ASEAN and BIMSTEC, and I would include SAARC as well. So I agree with both the panelists, but at the same time, it is always amazing to see how Southeast Asians and and East Asian regions, things are taken on a issue based. There is that wounds and memories of history. At the same time, they can kind of make it issue based than have like a dichotomy when it comes to like Taiwan and China. They have such a challenging political history. At the same time, if you look at economic partnership, they work so well, and that is true in the case of many of the Southeast Asian countries and so on. So I mean, I am from South Asia, but I have to say that there is a kind of discipline and organized approach among that people in the region, which may be slightly lacking in South Asian region, because many times we've tried to kind of work together on various issues. To some extent, we are successful, but many times it's challenging. But it could be because there's a history, but the kind of there is even like Indian Standard Time. I think there's a lack of discipline there, which I have to say. But on the other hand, ASEAN region, countries are so small, and so it's very easy to kind of organize and work together, or rather it's a necessity as well. Like India possibly can, be independent and sustain on its own, but maybe ASEAN countries really need to be mutually dependent and kind of work together, which may be one reason why they can kind of come together and in the form of ASEAN, while other partnerships don't work. From a human rights point of view, Asia is the only region where we don't have like a cohesive institution to hold human rights violations or violators accountable. Europe, Africa, Latin America, US, all of them have institutions. But somehow in Asia, it's challenging. But again, when you look at ASEAN, they have started a Human Rights Commission. They have started a declaration. So there is a certain sense of discipline. I don't know if we can go back to the Asian value concept and Confucianism and so on, whether that's what, there is no study based on that. But I do feel there is a discipline and mutual independence because of the geographical placing of these countries that possibly is kind of making them work together out of necessity, which is not seen in South Asia, sadly.
Thank you. Dr. Nabi? Dr. Nabi, would you like to say something? Okay. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go, which is that for me, I think it seems to me that BIMSTEC and some of these regional bodies in South Asia are still a platform for national level positions. It isn't about the region, it's about finding your country's position in a regional forum. So
can I add to that, Neha, if that is not a problem? Just to because I closely work with BIMSTEC, just to make sure that these are two sub-regional platforms, and these are institutional bodies just to come up with the institutional mandates for the national development priorities. So therefore, it has less to do with identity or national ethnic issues rather than to deal with broader development and bilateral, multilateral cooperation agenda. So it has less to do with the diverse ethnic mandates. Even if you look at the Myanmar crisis as at the moment, as Mark highlighted, look at the Rohingya issue, for an example, even if that is the case, the Buddhist nationalist or the Burmese Buddhist in Rakhine and the Muslim Rohingyas in Rakhine had a history back during the Second World War, in which the Rakhine Muslims were more in line with the British Allied forces, where the pro-Japanese forces were essentially the Buddhist Arakan or the Rakhine Buddhists. So that sort of composition played an important role in the Burmese understanding of ethnicity to a great extent. And the Burmese had a complete different understanding of the nationhood than the Rohingyas or the Arakanese. And even if you go to Kachin and Shan, they're still fighting for their own ethnic identity, being recognized as an identity within the ethnic, recognized ethnic group or ethnic community within the constitution of Myanmar. So even if you go to Cambodia and Vietnam, you have certain sort of tensions within the society. So again, as a result, you'd probably see BIMSTEC or even ASEAN more of a security, more of a development and less of a security agenda or institution, which has a sub-regional mandates rather than greater regional mandates.
Thank you. But either way you look at it, whether sub-regional or whether it has a development mandate, you can't, and that's what we were speaking about right at the beginning. You can't, at this point at which we're sitting, divorce the whole aspect of values when you're looking at development, whether it is regional development or national level development. And I think that essentially is the problem. That we've gone too far in our planning on development without looking at these ethnocentric, collective identity aspects, which has to come and play, whether at the sub-regional, regional level bodies, SAARC, BIMSTEC, ASEAN, etc.
Hi, everyone. I think Neha has been frozen again, but I know the next question she was intending to ask Professor Kim, Rebecca Chung-Hee Kim, who was actually one of our speakers in our first roundtable, to address her question. I think she had a question specifically for Professor Mark Thompson. So Rebecca, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And then thank you for your kind of very lively and thought-provoking discussion. Just I would like to specifically ask to Professor Thompson, because this is really interesting for me to think about and ponder. And you've discussed about Asian value to vernacularize the liberalism. So if then, could you share your thought on how this unique VL can contribute to liberalism or capitalism in global society? Can you think Asian value to something for good for the global society? If you think Asian value can, how, the way? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. And if I understood correctly, there are a couple different parts. The first part is how does this contribute to liberalism in the region? And I hope it was clear that I think this is quite essential to if you want to call it a liberal project. And you know, like even the term liberalism, right, in certain contexts seems kind of tainted. And people often don't like to use the term because it seems too Western and so on. So I think this whole vernacularized project, which, by the way, I'm calling vernacularized liberalism. That's not generally what advocates of it themselves talk about. They talk about, you know, Buddhist values. They'll talk about civic Islam and so on. So it's a project which, in a sense, you know, one uses a religious framework, and this was also I mentioned by Shahab in his comment that, you know, it's a question of interpretation. It's a question of how you think about these things, and there are these interpretations which can lead to these protest movements, anti-authoritarian instances, and so on. So that, I think it's very important. My paper was not. Second point is that I took as sort of a normative question about, you know, is this kind of a promising platform for Asian values? I mean, it is you're right, it is a form of Asian value. People are arguing this is Asian, for this distinctly Buddhist or distinctly Islamic or whatever religious tradition, Catholic tradition or Confucianist. Kim Dae-jung was arguing Confucianist tradition. So, you know, it depends on this tradition, but this is something, and they're making this argument very strongly normative. And the Malaysian politician, often oppositionist, Anwar Ibrahim, wrote a book about this in the mid-90s, talking about how this could be a future of Asia. So I think advocates of this position certainly feel like it can be a real alternative to Asian values in a more authoritative system.
Are there any more questions from the audience, or would somebody from our group of speakers like to say anything as we sort of come really to the close of this round?
Neha, I do have a question for Shahab.
Go ahead.
So I really agree with what Shahab said about, like, you know, contamination of in a colonial inheritance that South Asia received, and contamination of thoughts and so on. I do believe that there is that cultural cognition. I think Professor Dan Kahan had written a good paper on that. Like, in South Asians, we do have a subjugated mentality sometimes, which could be like a, you know, product of imperialism or colonialism or whatever, right? But you mentioned that authoritarianism is going to remain in South Asia, which I thought was quite pessimistic. As a human rights professional, I would like to see a South Asian or the whole world to be empowered and kind of go forward and come out of that cultural conditionality and really embrace a world with all the individualism that they have while respecting everything around. So why are you pessimistic? I mean, are you being pessimistic or are you being realistic? You know, can you address that?
I love that part. I am not saying that we have been contaminated for sure, but certainly we had some sort of colonial, I would rather say colonial disruption in our system, and which can be good, which can be bad. we can always argue about it. When I talk about quasi-authoritarianism, I don't always mean authoritarianism in a political sense. Now, let me take three, four examples. With the technological growth, we started to map. One thing is, what kind of hate speech do we see in the social media? And we start to see phenomenal rise of hate speech in the social media, which means youth are essentially using more hate speech to assert their power over certain group, caste, class, which has never been present in the earlier time. So that gives me one understanding that there is a more power exercise being reinforced in the social system. Even if you take YouTube, for an example, in many cases, the language those are coming in, sometimes we struggle between hate speech, the religious extremism, and the political extremism. That means we are still struggling with the rise of new sort of vocabulary and narratives, which does not essentially speak for softer tone in terms of politics. The third important factor is the fascination for ultranationalism, which is also in the rise, not only in the case of India, but also in the case of across the region, whether it is Afghanistan, because what will happen in Afghanistan after the 1st of January, we do not know. So that means, again, if you look at what we are now listening to in Arakan, which is Rakhine, to a great extent, that even at some point of time in Time magazine, it was mentioned Buddhist bin Laden. So you always have heard about Osama bin Laden. Now you are listening to new narrative, which is called Buddhist bin Laden. So you are again now listening. This is Time which has featured, right? So again, if you look at Sri Lanka, you're now seeing that this is also being resurfaced, the Colombo attack and everything. So again, going back to Yuval Harari, and he was at some point of time saying that what the KGB and CIA couldn't do in 3 months of time, one mobile phone can do it in 6 hours of time. That means you are now creating much more of a panoptic society in which the surveillance is coming back. So there is a new book called the Surveillance Capitalism, in which again coronavirus comes in, COVID comes in. Even in somebody was showing that look at the contact tracing. There is a lot of grievances going on across the societies where people are now asking the question that why are you doing this contact tracing? Whether this is a part of the panopticism practiced by the state. So you're also seeing that Bentham and others are coming back. That's why at some point of time I said, are we heading back to the pre-Westphalian system or the natural state where essentially now challenging the social contract, which Rousseau, Hobbes and others envisioned earlier. So this is the reason my skepticism comes in, and this is the reason I'm saying that identity now is getting back to the pre-colonial time or the pre-Westphalian time. And that is the reason when I was talking about that article on COVID-19, by saying that, look, this is the time when I'm seeing that people, how they used to think back in time regarding the state institutions, before the famine and the post-famine, and before the Mughals came and post-Mughals came, is again happening in the same manner. The trends are pretty much there. So this is the reason I say that authoritarianism is not essentially political. It's something that you practice within your family, practice within your community, society, and everywhere. So this is why my fear of quasi-authoritarianism or the patriarchal authoritarianism, sometimes I equate authoritarianism with patriarchal hierarchy too. Does it make any sense to you, Lipsy?
I understand that, there is definitely that cultural hierarchy, and I completely agree that there is so much of cultural, hierarchical problems that exist. from which we need to. But the reasons that you said make me feel that it's more of a, fear or the evil of the technology that we are still, which we are yet to kind of, get a hold of, than kind of, I'm very positive staying in the US, being part of the presidential campaign, seeing Trump go. There was that, nationalistic sentiments, but the systems are in place in this country. And therefore, we were able to kind of get Trump out. And so I feel South Asian or in Asia, I personally don't foresee quasi-authoritarianism to stay, because there is a rise of NGOs, there is a rise of civil society and advocacy, there is kind of an empowerment. And you talk about hate speech and so on, it's kind of a freedom of expression. Before, all of these things existed in their minds, but it was not expressed well. So I see it as different ways in which, sentiments and things are out in the open. In some sense, a liberation in one sense of individuals, unlike before. Now people have the courage to kind of express themselves, unlike before. They are breaking the barriers of authoritarianism in the small family setting or the social setting or national setting or internationally, which is aided by technology. So I kind of see it as positive in one way. So I really hope we will be able to kind of really come out of authoritarianism of all kinds. Although there's a right.
Thanks for stepping in, but I think I'll have to cut this conversation as interesting as it is. I sort of agree with Shahab that it's authoritarianism, not politically, but in different forms, and a lot of people actually ask for it, sort of preferring it, and sort of moving in that direction as well. But anyhow, I think today's discussion really points to the fact that, there is a need for us to continuously discuss it. Some fascinating thoughts, some fascinating ideas just about begun. And so when a lot of people ask us, what is the end of Asianism, Retold, what do you want to achieve? I think the answer that I would give is that the means is pretty much the end in this case. So the means being, these continued conversations, this continued dialogue, and creating a space for Asian discussion and Asian values. So with that, I think we've come to the close of this roundtable. And I wanted to, on behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, as well as the Center for Asian Leadership, thank each one of our speakers for your absolutely fascinating ideas for the discussion, for our participants who have stayed with us for 2.5 hours. And I hope you will join us for the next roundtable in October. We'll let you know the details. Thank you so much.